Hi everyone. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you, Ritwik.
Yes. Thank you everyone for your patience. We were going through some technical difficulties. Thanks so much for staying on. This is Frandata, and we're going to be talking today about the European franchise market. On the webinar today, it's myself, Ritwik Donde. I am, just to introduce myself, I am a senior research analyst here at Frandata. I have been working here for close to 10 years, working on a whole host of research projects for franchisors and suppliers. And recently I have moved my focus to international strategic development. Also joining us today on the call is Peter Schwarzer. Peter is the Director at Large at Frandata, and he is presently based out of Munich, Germany, and also works as the Managing Director for Leos Franchise Consulting and is an Associate Partner for Franchise Pool International. Again, thank you so much for staying on with our webinar today, and apologies for the technical delays. To get started today, just to give you, we want to start off by giving you a regional perspective on how big Europe is and how big the market for Europe is. Right now, Europe includes about 51 independent states, and the European Union itself has 27 member states, with UK on the verge of going out thanks to the Brexit. Just to give you a perspective on how big the market is, if you take a look at Norway, for example, it occupies roughly around 323,000 square kilometers area, making it slightly larger than the state of Mexico in terms of its geographic area, but it's double the population of New Mexico. Norway currently has about 5 million people. New Mexico is closer to about 2.5 million. However, having said that, a lot of the population in this country lives in and around the Oslo metropolitan area. On the other hand, if we look at Romania, sort of has a bad rap politically in terms of the political environment over there, but Bucharest has a GDP per capita of over 26,000 euros, and that makes it comparable to few of the larger cities or even some of the states like Idaho or Mississippi. So that kind of gives you an idea of how huge the European market is. But there are complexities involved, geographical complexities. Like I said, 27 members of the European Union with UK on the way out, and the presence of different types of economic trade agreements, economic regionalities, make navigating the business more complex in this marketplace. As you can see, the Eurozone has a few countries, and then there are multiple overlaps in terms of the trade agreements and geographical complexities of this marketplace. Europe in itself, if we go look at the franchise market, accounts for about 18% of the global market share in terms of franchise businesses operating in the region. Geographically, it's almost as big as the US in terms of landmass, but as we can see here, it still has a low share in terms of the overall global franchise market share. A lot of markets in this region are still developing or are even underdeveloped, presenting us with a huge opportunity for American franchisors to go and develop and grow their systems in different parts of the European region. A good perspective of how big and well developed the different countries are in the European market can be seen through what we call the McDonald's Index for Franchise Market Maturity. While some markets like France, as you can see on your screen, are fairly mature, France or Germany or even the United Kingdom are very mature markets. What this index does is it basically gives you an idea of how well developed a market for a franchise system is within the different countries. The hypothesis being that McDonald's always more often than not is a first entrant when a new franchise market opens up. And the more franchise units McDonald's has, the better developed that market is, or the more mature that market is within the specific country. As an example, France is a well-developed franchise has a well-developed franchise industry. It ranks number one in Europe in terms of sales. The Spanish market, for instance, on the other hand, has close to 1,400 franchise brands, of which a majority are homegrown concepts. UK, Italy, France, they all are in varying forms of maturity right now, more closer to their being the most mature markets. So how does Europe compare with US, with the US franchise market space? Europe has about 13,000 active franchise brands in the entire region. Compare that to the 3,700 plus brands that we have actively franchising in the US. There is a huge difference in terms of just the number of brands in the market. But if we take a look at the number of units per brand in each of those markets, we can see a stark distinction. Europe, for instance, has 36 franchise units per brand. In US, that average is 135 units per brand. So a lot of the brands in America, in the US market, are more developed and are larger systems than brands in Europe. Another example that we can give here is Turkey and France. They both have the greatest number of franchise brands, followed by Germany, which has close to about 1,000 franchise brands. Spain has around 900, and the UK has more than 800 franchise brands actively franchising. Kind of gives us a perspective on how huge this market space is. The thing to note over here is the fact that nearly 80% of the brands that are currently operating and offering franchises in Europe are domestic homegrown brands, which means the competition for a foreign franchisor coming into this market space is more often than not going to be with these homegrown brands. Just to give you a few examples, there was a customer satisfaction study conducted in Germany recently. That satisfaction study had no foreign brands among the top 10 in the top 10 list. Hilton was the first brand in that list, and it was ranked number 12. The highest ranking US food concept was Pizza Hut at number 37. So a lot of these better performing brands in the European market are homegrown brands, and that's who the competition is when it comes to American brands entering this market space. But like I said, it is a huge market. The European Union single market, on its own accounts for roughly around 500 million consumers. The fact that Europe is predominantly composed of countries with developed, thriving economies that have large populations with disposable income is one of the main reasons that we've seen homegrown franchises become so successful. The EU was ranked number 2 by World Bank after the United States, of course, in terms of the household consumer expenditure, and the overall household consumer expenditure for the entire EU region was pegged at close to 9 trillion, contributing to 56% of the region's GDP. Again, it gives us a perspective on how big that marketplace is. Having said that, Europe definitely is one of the hottest regions for rapid franchise growth. A lot of franchise brands are targeting this region for quick growth. And to discuss more on the potential of the region, we have with us Peter Schwarzer today. He joins us from Munich, Germany. He is the founder, managing director of Leo's Franchise Consulting and an associate partner of Franchise Pool International. He is vastly experienced when it comes to franchise development and franchise business strategies in the European markets. And we are going to be speaking today with him about the state of franchise market in Europe, learn what it takes to succeed in the market given the changes that the region is going through right now. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Yeah, hello everyone from Munich in the south of Germany. It's one of the economically strongest regions in the country, and since Germany is Europe's biggest economy, it also means that Munich and the state of Bavaria is basically one of the strongest areas in the on the entire continent. And I can see that Ritwik already put up the slide on Brexit, and I think that seems. Sorry, Ritwik, I didn't mean to interrupt.
So, exactly, that was the biggest question for the day today. The big question looming over entire European franchise market is Brexit. And as someone who is sitting close to this activity, what are going to be some of the major implications when the Brexit happens, and what should U.S. franchisors be keeping a keen eye on?
So I think the first thing I would say to that, Brexit remains a moving target, and if anyone tells you he or she exactly knows what's going to happen and how it's going to play out, I would just walk away, because nobody really knows. It remains uncertain. It's being delayed. It seems every other week there's another delay, because the British government can't make up its mind, and it's without getting political, but it's basically incompetence on the government side as well as the opposition side. So there's not a single party that really knows what to do. It just so happened that this morning I had a meeting with an international franchise development manager for a British brand, and I asked him, point blank, Brexit, what's your biggest headache? And he said the potential impact on our supply chain. And that is something that U.S. companies, or in fact any non-British company, needs to take into consideration if they plan to enter the UK. There's a lot of uncertainty. If it's a so-called no-deal Brexit, then a lot of things may collapse. A friend of mine works for a large PE company that owns a couple of brands in Europe as well as in the US. And he said if there's a no-deal Brexit where nobody knows how the supplies will come in, then they're basically, excuse my French, they're screwed because their supplies will last for a day. To mitigate that, you have British companies that set up a presence on the continent just to have a legal entity within the EU. And they also set up alternative supply chains. So the British guy I talked to this morning, they just happen to have a humongous distribution center set up in Germany for their continental Europe operations. The other thing you need to look at is the supply of labor. Because of the impending exit of the United Kingdom, there's also this is going to have an impact on the free movement of labor, and predominantly Eastern European people who live and work in the UK very often as unskilled laborers, waiters, baristas, and so forth. They're leaving the UK in drones because they don't know what's going to happen to them. And that means that some franchise brands can't get enough staff. And that is going to have an impact on your operations as well. And I think the other point is that the United Kingdom still uses the British pound as opposed to the euro, and the currency fluctuations have been much more volatile ever since Brexit was decided, and that is something that you need to take into consideration as well if you are planning to have British and continental European operations.
Sounds like a lot of regulations are going to change. And speaking of regulations, one of the first things that a new franchisor does in the U.S. would be to file an FDD. And from what I understand, I believe there are 6 European countries that have enacted a similar disclosure law: Belgium, France, Italy, Romania, Spain, Sweden. and Sweden. How different are they from each other? Is it easy to get a disclosure document done in some of these countries? Is it tougher than the U.S.?
So again, it's different from country to country, but generally what I would say is if you are a U.S. franchisor and you're used to U.S. disclosure requirements, your FTD and pre-contractual discussions with franchise candidates, I don't think anything in Europe will surprise you. So you already, or the United States already set the benchmark for what is disclosure, how much needs to be disclosed, and what's a proper disclosure document. And even if some European countries or franchise representatives in European countries wouldn't want to admit to it, you are basically the standard. So if you know how to file an FTD, I do not believe you will find anything that is new to you as American or U.S. franchisors when you go to Europe. I can tell you in Germany, for example, the Franchise Association here is basically fighting tooth and nail against any franchise laws and regulations. They prefer a self-regulating industry where they set standards, best practice standards, but the association here can't really enforce them. And when you talk to people within franchising, what you will find is most of them seem to support actually more disclosure than what's currently the norm in Europe, and they wouldn't mind franchise regulations either. So again, what's already going on in the United States is pretty much the standard that some countries are looking at. If in doubt, you will be required to disclose less, but it will always be good practice to guide the candidates along. They will ask the same questions anyway: how much money I can make, what are my obligations, what are your obligations, so in that regard, I believe U.S. franchisors actually have an advantage, because what many people in Europe still don't understand is that as franchise brands, you're not just competing with, the other burger brand or the other pizza brand or whatnot. You're also competing for franchise candidates. And I believe those brands that can show good performance and base it on real numbers will definitely have an edge over other brands that hold their cards close to their chest.
Should American franchisors looking at this market be know something about earnings claims? Is that something that is regulated or that's freely allowed? How is it in different countries?
Again, it's if you have an earnings claim, if you have an item 19, and if you disclose the same information in Europe, I am not aware of anyone not allowing you to do this. There are a couple of brands. I just went on some websites, and some of them actually do disclose that information, where they just give an average. I personally see particularly Scandinavian brands and established brands being far more willing to share that information. But Europe is very big on privacy laws, and average income or revenues. Some of this is kind of is regarded as private. So just out of a habit, people tend to be a little bit shy about disclosing that kind of information. But my personal take always is, if you have good performance, why not use it in your marketing materials for franchise candidates?
One of the things that earlier you and I were discussing before our webinar today, you mentioned something about place of arbitration and how franchisees in Europe look at it. Can you shed a little bit of light on that?
Yeah, so I would say that place of arbitration, most people in Europe will probably bark at a clause in the franchise agreement that would put the place of arbitration somewhere in the United States. Any kind of legal costs in the U.S. are prohibitive for any European operation, and this, in fact, I just went through this myself, where I talked with a client, and they wanted this. It was an American or U.S. franchisor, and they wanted New York as place of arbitration. And I basically said, I'm not going to do this unless you move the place of arbitration to Europe. There are two places that are pretty established where you can have international arbitration. The one is Paris, the other one is London. And it's still expensive from a European perspective, far less expensive than having to represent yourself in the United States with a U.S. lawyer and all the expenses that go with it. So that is something to keep in mind, that a lot of people will just refuse to accept that in the clause.
Well, that's great information, and I just want to move a little bit to a different topic. Earlier, when we were talking about Brexit, we were all, you touched upon the flow of labor across different markets and different countries. Is hiring store-level employees or even franchisor-level representatives, is it a challenge in certain markets? From what I understand, for instance, Spain has a lot of high unemployment benefits, and that could potentially act as a deterrent for someone to either become an entrepreneur or work at a franchise business or store. Do you think it's difficult, it's challenging for franchisees to find good quality labor? Are there restrictive laws around labor in certain markets that U.S. franchisors should be aware of?
So right now, I think in a lot of the stronger economies in Europe, everyone struggles to find labor. Even Germany has a very well-established vocational training where you train to become a plumber, a hairdresser, what have you, and businesses don't find enough staff, and that is a fairly new development because we have a very strong labor market right now. In countries such as Spain, where particularly youth unemployment is very high, I think it will be probably easier to find staff. On a certain career level, to find franchise. I'm sorry, that's a different area. But most countries have some sort of minimum wage. But just to address that, when they introduced the minimum wage in Germany a couple of years ago, I talked to some of the German McDonald's managers, and they basically said that didn't even register. That was never an issue for us. And I haven't heard anyone complain about the minimum wage here in Germany. There are discussions to increase it, but it's not a big issue at this point. In other countries, again, if you have a very strong labor market, you will compete not just against other franchise brands, but also non-franchise concepts, big corporations, which are going to look for labor. You can try to attract labor from other countries. You may have noticed on one of the earlier slides, which was this kind of mumbo-jumbo of how the EU is set up and all these overlapping agreements and contracts. There is something called the Schengen area, and that basically are the European Union countries that allow free movement of people and labor. And you can attract people from, say, Eastern Europe to work in Scandinavia or Western Europe, places like Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands. You may run into language issues. In some places, if it's a large cosmopolitan area, I just have a couple of coffee places around the corner. There's a Starbucks here. All the baristas are Americans. They all speak English. But if you go in the countryside, people wouldn't go there because they're not used to that.
One of our participants is actually asking us this question, and it pertains to labor cost. Is it high? Should franchisors account for a higher labor cost margin in the European markets as compared to what they are seeing in the U.S.? What are your thoughts on those?
So the minimum wage is different from country to country. It is not going to be lower than in the United States. It's probably either going to be about the same or higher. And then even in the United States, depending on where you are, the difference between the federal minimum wage and what some states or even metropolitan areas decided, that's also a variance that you have to take into consideration. The same applies here. You will have a bit of a different cost structure, but that also depends on your market. So real estate tends to be a little bit more expensive in general terms in Europe, but again, there will be plenty of areas where your real estate is going to be far cheaper than New York or Los Angeles, and then you will run into it. Again, it also depends on your concept. There are rules and regulations for trades in Germany. If you want to open up a hair salon, a plumber, or a carpentry shop, you need to be a master craftsman or tradesman. And that is something, to actually become a simple plumber, that in itself takes 3 years. The same applies to hairdressers. Any kind of vocational training really is a 3-year training program. Then you need to get work experience, and then you can go through another round of 3 years to become a master craftsman. And only once you're a master craftsman, you can actually open up your own hairdresser, your own hair salon, plumbing business, and such things. The only way to get around this is if you hire one of those master tradesmen, and they demand a higher salary because they have the certificates. That system is relatively unique to Germany, or I want to say unique to Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. But in those markets, that is something you have to take into consideration.
Great information, Peter. So then the bigger question becomes, which markets should franchisors be looking at? Are there countries in Europe which are more franchise friendly than others? And how do the American franchisors find which ones are best suited for their kind of product or their kind of business model? So this is something that I, as a franchisor and as a consultant, I have to tell you, you need to do your homework and conduct market research. So you can never look at Europe as one place. Europe is a place with 50 countries, 51 countries, or whatever we had on the first slide, and every country is different, and even within countries you have at times very big differences between regions. As I told Ritwik earlier this week, here it sometimes matters what side of the river you live on. I grew up in the border area between Germany and the Netherlands, and there was just the River Rhine that went through my home region where I grew up. You cross the river, everything is different. The language, the food, the architecture, the literature, the culture, and it's literally just crossing a bridge. And so that's how you kind of need to look at the market. If you are wondering about ease of starting a business, there are countries that you probably have never heard of, but if you look at Armenia, which is a former Soviet republic,
It's right now it ranks number 1 in Europe when it comes to ease of starting a business. Globally, it ranks 8. Then a country probably all of us have heard of, Ireland. It ranks 10 globally and is number 2 in Europe when it comes to ease of starting a business. But on the flip side, Germany, it's Europe's largest economy. It ranks 16 in Europe and globally 114 when it comes to ease of starting a business.
Oh, wow.
So that is something where you know, when it comes to rules and regulations you have to meet, how long does it take to open up a business and so forth. And we're not even talking about having found a franchisee. You know, this is after you've found a franchisee. Then this person needs to be able to open up shop. Generally speaking, you know, the strong economies, you know, you will have to compete against some entrenched players. As Ritwik said earlier, a lot of them will be domestic companies. And for me, it was interesting to read that article where they looked at customer satisfaction, because there were 2 main conclusions for me. One was that U.S. companies or franchisors, it's actually not bad news that domestic brands are so strong. It only shows that they're catching up with what the United States has done over the last 50, 60, 70 years when it comes to franchising. It does seem to support or underline the fact that, you know, culturally they seem to have, domestic brands seem to have an edge over foreign brands. There's something they do that helps customers or makes customers more satisfied with their services than U.S. franchisors. You have
so
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I was just going because I was just going to ask you, you know, which industries then are sort of hot right now, and in which countries? You know, in the U.S. we are seeing a rise of elderly care. We are seeing growing QSR space. You know, is this mirroring in certain countries in Europe? Which industries are hot right now?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So demographics speak, and and this is just me in my portfolio. I have 2 non-European home healthcare companies that are trying to get into the European market. So this is definitely a market to grow. And again, it's, you know, everyone knows the demand is there, and everyone knows that the real challenge is not to find customers, but to find actually the carers, the staff, at least here in Europe. So that's really a pressing problem for everyone who's running a home health care brand. It seems that fitness companies, you can always add another studio to your market, or fitness studio. Somehow that always works. And I guess that goes together with demographics as well, because, you know, the older people stay fitter longer than they used to, and the services are there to support that. And I also think when it comes to food, it's definitely a market to look at. But I would also say that is let's just put it this way. McDonald's Germany or Europe is very, very different from McDonald's in the United States. So just to give you an example, most McDonald's here are really referred to as McCafés, and they look super stylish. And you actually get your coffee when you don't have it to go. You get your coffee in a China cup with a saucer in Germany.
Oh, wow.
At McDonald's. You can also order beer at McDonald's, for example, you know. So that is something where, you know, German McDonald's executives, when they go to the United States, some of them are really shocked to see the difference between a McDonald's restaurant in Europe versus in the United States. But they have successfully managed to tap into some of the local preferences. The only reason why McDonald's Germany, and I keep on pressing McDonald's Germany because Germany is a big test market for McDonald's, and I believe it's actually the third or fourth most important market for the entire system. The only reason why they don't offer organic burgers all year round is because they cannot get the supply. They can't get enough meat or beef for that. If they could, they would actually offer organic burgers here because the demand is so high.
Which raises an interesting question about culture. With 51 independent states across the entire European market, European region, it's a varied culture. Germany is different as a market culturally than, let's say, Spain or France is. So, can you point us to a few examples of such cultural differences, and maybe kind of with examples again, how successful franchise brands are sort of navigating the cultural minefield in terms of differences over there?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think, McDonald's is the example I just mentioned, some of the things they did right. I can maybe point to 2 or 3 examples where I think it's sometimes challenging. A lot of companies like to divvy up Europe into particular regions, and then maybe they look at Scandinavia as one region, and then maybe at the German-speaking countries, Germany, Switzerland, and Austria as one region. So in Scandinavia that works, even though Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian are not exactly the same languages, but they can all speak to each other in their own languages and perfectly understand each other. It actually works to have someone responsible for the region of Scandinavia when it comes to franchise development, for example. If you hire a local broker, if that person has connections in these countries, then that usually works. If you look at Denmark, the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, and Sweden's second city, these are 2 different countries, 2 different languages, 2 different kingdoms, because both have a king. These 2 cities are actually considered one metropolitan area because they're connected via a bridge, across some of the main Danish islands to the Swedish mainland. So you go into a different country, but it's basically one metropolitan area. Their thinking in terms of the Scandinavian region is actually something that works. On the flip side, just because Germany, Austria, and Switzerland speak German, you can never look at those 3 countries as one region. So I do not understand the Swiss when they speak German because their German is completely different. I actually there's a very large German fitness concept called Body Street. They just entered the U.S. market. They're one of the most successful fitness brands in Europe. I think they have 300 locations in a couple of countries, and they sold either an area development or a master license to a German guy for Switzerland. The German person lived in the border region, and it was an utter failure because the Swiss will not buy anything from a German. I cannot find franchisees for brands in Switzerland unless I work very closely together with one of my Swiss partners.
Wow.
So that is one thing to take into consideration. And even within countries, where I grew up, my local dialect is relatively close to Dutch. I don't speak Dutch, but I can kind of understand what they're talking about. I now live in Munich, Bavaria. When they speak their local dialect, to me, it's a foreign language. I don't understand a single word. So these are some regional differences. And then, multiply that by the fact that you have 51 countries and, what did you say, Ritik, 124 different languages. something like this.
Yeah.
So you do need a local contact. So you can't just come in and have an American phone number and email address on your brochure and expect anyone to call you. This is this is not going to work. And I would also advise against just using your own marketing campaigns that work very well in the United States for franchisee recruitment, for example, and just translate it into any local language. I have one client. They had an American company, and they had a quote in their brochure on how well the training program works. And this is all fine. The issue was that the quote was by someone who got into the brand through the Veteran program, so ex-military guy, and he compared the initial training program with how he, as a drill sergeant, turned people into soldiers when he was in the army. This works very well in the U.S. context, where the military has a very different standing. It's a total no-no in Germany. If you do that in Germany, people only read the word drill sergeant, and that's it. You're going to lose them. And I can tell you again from personal experience, my wife had a motivational team come in from the United States, and they were all ex-U.S. Navy SEALs. And they ran something like a mock military program. Now, my wife works for a large German company, and the fact that she got U.S. Navy SEALs in to do this kind of prep talk made it to the national news. It was shredded by big German dailies because of our history. We don't think about the military in the same way as other countries do. So, these are just some examples of, do's and don'ts, and where it's really important to get local expertise.
So then on the flip side, how important is the country of origin of the brand that franchisees are looking at? Does being an American brand have more value, have more brand equity when it comes to selling in European countries?
Depends on the product. If you were, if an American, for lack of a better example, if an American cheese brand would try to put up shop in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, or in France, I'm not saying it's going to be impossible. You just have to fight a lot of prejudices, because I don't want to offend anyone, but those people's perspective will be, well, what do the Americans know about cheese or wine? In Germany, Germans love their cars, and they're big on engineering. And our prejudice, or a common German prejudice against American cars, is that they're badly designed. That may not be up to date anymore, but that's how people think. So if you come in as a car services brand, for example, the first thing I would make sure is that your technology is up to speed and on par with what they do here in Germany. I don't want to mention any brand names, but there was a concept that tried to enter the market here in Germany, some kind of muffler and brake repair service, American company. And they actually found a guy who wanted to sign the franchise contract until he saw the technology they used. And that's when he got cold feet, because he said, look, we haven't used this in 20 years. We are light years ahead of you, what you're using. He didn't sign the contract. So it really depends on the product. As a U.S. company to come in, as a burger concept, for example, of course that will work, because that's what people associate with the United States. There's a reason why Five Guys is now entering the German market, and my kids are very happy because they grew up in the United States, So finally we have Five Guys in Munich. Again, is there a way where you have to adapt your concept, your marketing, your messaging to the local market and preferences?
Great stuff. then the biggest question for a lot of our franchisor friends in the U.S. becomes how do you sell to franchisees? Help us understand how sophisticated franchisees are over there. Where do they conduct any sort of pre-research, market research into the brand and the health of the brand? Where do they go to kind of get this information from? How do they behave when it comes to a buying decision?
You will probably have the exact same variants of types of franchisees that you have in the United States. There are people who just want to buy themselves a job, and then there are sophisticated investors who they need to like the concept, but they also need to like the numbers. As far as sophistication goes, there is very, very little private equity involvement in franchising in Europe. That is almost unheard of. There is no ROAC. There is no, Ritwik, help me out. What's another big PE company in franchising?
Lichtman,
TA
Associates.
There is no European equivalent. What is kind of becoming established now, or it's not that unusual anymore, is that you actually have multi-unit franchisees, but this is only multi-unit. There is the idea to invest into maybe 2, 3, or 4 brands is completely alien. This is where franchise development in the U.S. is really light years ahead of what's happening here. You will have to, depending on how you would like to enter the market. If you're looking for a master franchisee, the smaller countries you can probably sell to one person. In Germany, we usually recommend dividing the country into 4 to 5 regions. And, due to the lack of PE involvement, and you don't have, large investor groups that have discovered franchising. A friend of mine is the founding partner of a private equity company, and of course I talked to him and said, hey, how about franchising? And he said, this is peanuts for us. Unless it's 20 million investment, we don't even look at this. And this is how a lot of private equity companies look at their investment strategy. So even if you sold all of Germany as a master franchise, and then let's say for a full-service sit-down restaurant brand where each restaurant would cost you $1 million, if you open up 5 restaurants and you sell the master license and then the guy finds his own franchisees, you're looking at an investment maybe of 5-6 million euros. And PE companies don't touch this. That is just small fry for them. So what you're looking at here is, in many cases, and that applies to a lot of European countries, is high net worth individuals. And you have to find those. There's no database for high net worth individuals. At least none I know, and that's a lot of work to kind of call these people, reach out to them, find them, and then find the right way to talk to them about the investment opportunity.
What works best then? Does going through brokers work better than attending conferences? Are there any other avenues that franchisors you've seen have taken up to find these high net worth individuals or find these master franchisee partners? Is there a marketplace?
So it's actually telling that at least the biggest, I believe the biggest franchise convention on the planet is actually in Paris. That happens once a year. London has its own show, and they actually have another convention that's dedicated to multi-unit franchisees. That's also a relatively new development, and it's also something that's coming over from the United States, because the company that organizes the multi-unit franchisee convention in the UK is actually an American outfit. And after I don't know how many years, but last year was actually the first time again that there was a franchise expo in Germany again, and they're going to do this in fall again this year. We actually we got good leads for some of our brands at the franchise expo. In fact, we were able to sell, I think, 2 or 3 master licenses right then and there.
Okay.
But that's also where all the stars aligned. You know, it was the right people were there, it was the right brand and the right market they were trying to enter. It's usually not that easy. If you don't want to go with a broker, I would still recommend having someone on the ground who speaks the language. And even though you're looking, if you sell a master or an area developer, you're looking at investors, and those investors will be, you know, relatively comfortable in English to varying degrees, but most of them will be, you know, comfortable in English. It just is a whole different level if you get a phone call from someone who really speaks like you. Or who reaches out to you, or where you have a meeting. And I think Ritwik and I can also speak from personal experience. We sometimes, when we still work together at Frandata, we, you know, would usually, or sometimes would do phone interviews for research projects. And for the recruiting process, because it just so happened that for whatever reasons, the research team, there were no Americans on the research team. So everyone on the research team talked funny. And we would ask, you know, poor Edith Weissman and her sales team, can you help us recruit people? Because they listen to you. They hear an accent. We call people, they hear an accent, and we have a couple more hurdles to take. And I believe the same applies to, you know, any franchisor, American or non-American, but any non-domestic franchisor who tries to attract or network with potential candidates. So you need a local name, you need a local number.
One of the questions that's coming from our participants, is relates to the online listings. You know, there are a lot of websites in the U.S. where franchisors list their brands. Is this the same case in Europe? In certain markets, how helpful is it to have your brand listed on websites? Does it work?
It does, with the caveat that, again, it depends on your industry. Franchising itself doesn't have the same good reputation as it in some European countries than in the United States. So if someone in the U.S. has a good idea, you know, you sometimes hear people say, oh, you should franchise that. That is not going to be, nobody's going to say this in Europe, because there have been some bad examples. You know, some American brands, I don't want to mention names, but usually they have similar problems in international markets than as they do in their domestic market, and that makes it into the press. And so franchising sometimes is still considered, you know, to be a ripoff. You know, the poor franchisees, they just kind of have to do everything the franchisor says, and the franchisor collects money and doesn't care. That is sometimes a hurdle you have to take. And then it depends on your concept. So I tell most of my clients, do list online, if only for the you know, it gives you some legitimization. You know, you're willing to invest money. You may not get all the right leads, but it's a showcase, and it helps you. It basically creates a landing page for you when you do additional social media advertising and that sort of thing.
And is master franchising still, you know, still a valid way for U.S. brands to enter the European market? Have you seen franchisors do it otherwise and become successful? What's the best way out here?
I think that entirely depends on the franchisor's own growth strategy. So a master franchise is still something that a lot of people are using to grow in international markets. if you are okay with putting down the money and start the pilot unit yourself, or have someone, basically act as a managing director for your pilot unit, that also works. But then, of course, you have to put in a whole different franchise infrastructure. My personal experience is that depending on the market and depending on how quickly you would like to enter the market, it can be very, very hard to find a master for the reasons I mentioned. So if you're willing to invest more and put in 1 or 2 pilot units yourself, and then basically look for single unit franchisees, and then perhaps sell an existing system of, 5, 6, 7 units to a master franchisee who comes in later, that could be an option too.
Yes, I mean, just in UK, Italy, and France, there is some sort of a market testing kind of a requirement that franchise brands need to show as a regulatory requirement. So it's either of having a proof of concept or having some sort of validity towards the concept being tested within that particular market space. So you're absolutely right when you say those things. I just want to open this up to a few more questions from our listeners today. Is there anyone who has questions, who wants to know more about what we discussed today, more about the European market? We are happy to entertain questions. Peter's happy to answer any questions you have. Looks like we have a question around selling to franchisees. Is there any particular message? One of our participants is asking whether is there any particular messaging that brands have used in the past that has worked well for them? For example, French candidates are very apprehensive to talk about, the numbers, the ROIs, and the profitability. They want to know more about the qualitative benefits of their franchise. So is there messaging of such sort that has worked well for franchisors over there in countries, if you can talk to that?
So I would say to that, it's something where several things need to fall into place. You have someone who is open to investing. You approach him or her in the right way. That person believes in the concept, and that can be through all sorts of ways. You find, as I said, you find your master at one of those franchise conventions. You go to industry-specific conventions. You can do that too. But everyone wants to know, is this a good brand and how much money can I make? So everyone wants to talk about money. How you talk about money might have to be very, very different than from how you're used to it in the United States. So if you just walk in and say, this is a great opportunity, your margin is going to be X%, yada, 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 that can put some people off, because you don't necessarily want to say, this sounds from a European perspective can.
Hello? I think Peter, we've lost Peter over there on the phone. But I would like to kind of wrap up the webinar today. Again, apologies for all the technical delays that happened. But if any of the participants have any questions around the European market and how to go about developing in the different countries and markets within the European region, our email is on your screen. Please feel free to drop us a line. And we'd be happy to answer any questions, any specific questions that you may have around this topic. Thank you again for joining us for this webinar, and we hope that you join us again soon for another webinar on international development. very soon. Thank you again. Thank you, participants. And thanks, Peter, for joining us and shedding light and sharing those amazing little facts and stories on how different franchisors have grown over the course in different countries across the European market. Thank you so much.